Emma was tired after a long business trip. She pulled into her driveway looking forward to a quiet evening in her home on the ranch. But as she stepped out of her car, something felt off. Bright ribbons fluttered in the breeze. Chairs were neatly arranged across the lawn, and a large floral arch stood at the edge of her porch. Her heart skipped a beat. It looked like a wedding setup. But Emma hadn't planned any event, let alone a wedding at her house. She walked closer, her eyes scanning the decorations. Fresh flowers were everywhere, on the arch, lining the path, even tied to the mailbox. The smell of jasmine filled the air. A small sign by the gate read, "Today's celebration, Emily and John's wedding." Emma frowned. Who were Emily and John? How did this get scheduled on her property? She pulled out her phone and dialed the HOA office number listed on a small, laminated card stuck to one of the chairs. A woman answered quickly. "Hello, HOA office. How can I help you?" The voice said, "This is Emma Turner," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just got home and found a wedding set up in my yard. I have no idea what's going on. Did the HOA schedule an event here?" There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "Yes. The HOA scheduled a wedding event at your address. It was approved last month." Emma blinked. "Wait, approved by whom? I never gave permission. We have standing approval for community events on private properties," the woman explained. "It's part of the HOA policy." Emma's heart pounded. "I was never notified. This is my private property. You can't just schedule a wedding here without my consent." The woman's tone became firm. "Our records show the event is official. If you have concerns, please bring them to the next HOA meeting." Emma ended the call and looked around her yard again. The chairs, the arch, the flower arrangements, all ready for guests who would arrive soon. She couldn't believe it. How had this happened without her knowledge? Determined to understand, Emma stepped inside and grabbed the HOA handbook from her filing cabinet. She flipped through the pages, searching for any mention of events on private property. The section on events mentioned shared spaces like the clubhouse and park, but nothing about scheduling weddings or gatherings at someone's home without permission. She took out her phone again and started searching for local laws about property rights and event permissions. Several articles explained that homeowners have full control over their private property and that any use by others requires explicit consent. Feeling both frustrated and energized, Emma grabbed her keys and headed to the HOA office in person. When she arrived, the receptionist barely looked up as Emma explained the situation. The manager, Mr. Collins, came out after a few minutes. "Emma," he said, extending his hand. "I understand you have concerns about the event." "Yes," Emma replied. "This wedding was scheduled on my property without my approval. It's not only disrespectful, it's against the law." Mr. Collins sighed. "The HOA tries to plan events that bring the neighborhood together. We thought this would be a positive experience." "But it's my property," Emma said firmly. "You can't just schedule events here without asking me." He paused, then said, "We'll look into it. In the meantime, the wedding is still scheduled." Emma shook her head. "That's not acceptable." Walking back to her car, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about respect and control over her own home. She would not let this go quietly. That evening, she started reaching out to neighbors, hoping to find others who might help her take a stand. As the sun set over the ranch, Emma made a silent promise. She would fight to protect her home no matter what it took. After the unsettling discovery on her property, Emma knew she needed to understand the full picture. If the HOA truly thought they could schedule an event at her home without her permission, it was time to dive deep into the rules and laws surrounding the situation. She started by carefully rereading the HOA handbook, which she had tucked away in a drawer for years but never really needed to consult until now. Flipping through its pages, Emma searched for anything related to event scheduling, property rights, or homeowner responsibilities. What she found surprised her. The handbook detailed how common areas like the clubhouse, pool, and neighborhood park could be reserved for events with prior notice. But there was no mention anywhere of the HOA having authority to use private properties for community gatherings, especially without the homeowner's consent. That was a relief. But it only fueled her frustration. If the HOA had no written authority to do this, then on what grounds had they booked a wedding on her property? Determined to get a clearer answer, Kama called the county office to ask about local regulations concerning property use and event permits. The clerk she spoke with was helpful and polite. Property owners have the right to exclusive control over their land, she explained. Any event held on private property must have the owner's permission, especially if it involves more than just family or close friends. If the HOA tried to schedule a wedding without your consent, they likely overstepped. Emma jotted down notes, feeling validated by the official confirmation, but she also realized that having the facts wasn't enough. She would need to bring this information to the HOA board and make sure they understood that what they had done wasn't just inappropriate. It was against the rules and the law. That evening, Emma drafted a clear and polite letter to the HOA board president. She explained her findings, emphasized her rights as a homeowner, and requested immediate cancellation of the wedding event scheduled on her property. She also asked for a written confirmation that no future events would be planned on her home. Without her explicit permission, the next day, she dropped the letter off at the HOA office and sent a copy via email. Then she waited. A few days later, she received a reply from the board president, Mr. Stevens. The letter was carefully worded, but it was clear the HOA wasn't willing to back down. They acknowledged Emma's concerns but insisted the event was approved under a broad neighborhood engagement policy. The letter claimed the HOA had the right to schedule events on any property within the neighborhood. Boundaries to encourage participation and unity. Emma felt her frustration rising. The letter ignored her research and ignored her clear statement that she had never given permission. She decided she needed to take the conversation further. That week, Emma attended the next HOA board meeting, determined to speak her mind in person. The room was filled with familiar faces, some supportive neighbors, others more loyal to the board. When it was her turn, Emma stood up and calmly presented what she had learned. She shared excerpts from the HOA handbook, local regulations, and her belief that no one should schedule an event on private property without the homeowner's approval. Her words sparked a mix of nods and murmurs. Mr. Stevens responded carefully, repeating the HOA's position but promising to review the issue further. Still, Emma felt the situation wasn't resolved. The wedding date was getting closer, and decorations were already set up. Determined to protect her home, Emma began thinking about the next steps. She knew she needed allies and a plan that would stop the event from happening without permission. She reached out to a few neighbors she trusted, sharing her concerns and asking if anyone else had experienced overreach or unwanted decisions by the HOA. Some neighbors admitted they had felt uneasy about how the HOA operated but had stayed quiet, unsure if their voices would matter. Emma realized this wasn't just her fight. It was something that affected the neighborhood's sense of fairness and respect. That night, as she looked out over her decorated yard, Emma's resolve strengthened. She wouldn't let this wedding happen on her terms. Her home was hers to control. And she planned to make sure everyone understood that. The decorations stayed up all week. Each morning, Emma looked out her window and saw the same pastel drapes fluttering across her porch railing, the archway still standing on her lawn, and more folding chairs appearing each day. It felt like someone was slowly building a stage on her front yard. One she hadn't asked for and definitely didn't approve. But it wasn't just the decorations that made her uneasy. It was the looks. Neighbors passed by with curious glances, some quick nods, others avoiding eye contact altogether. It wasn't hostile, not yet, but it was clear word had gotten out. Some knew Emma hadn't approved the wedding. Others seemed unsure about what to believe. Emma decided to break the silence that afternoon. She walked down her street, stopping by a few homes where she'd shared a friendly wave or casual conversation over the years. Her first stop was the Thompsons. It's an older couple who had lived in the neighborhood longer than most. Mrs. Thompson greeted her warmly. "I've heard about the situation," she said in a quiet tone. "We were confused when the invitations listed your address." "I assumed you knew." "I had no idea," Emma said. "It was scheduled without asking me. I've been told it's part of some broad policy, but I've read every page of the handbook. There's nothing that gives them this right." Mrs. Thompson looked surprised, then concerned. "That doesn't sound right at all." Emma nodded. "That's what I thought." Encouraged, Emma moved on to visit a few other homes. She stopped by a young family's porch, then spoke to a retired school teacher who had always been friendly during walks. Some residents were hesitant to speak openly, but once Emma explained what was happening calmly and clearly, most agreed it didn't feel fair. Many said the same thing. "We didn't know we could say anything." That night, Emma typed up a short letter and printed out a dozen copies. It wasn't a call to action. It wasn't angry. It was simply a story, her side of it, with facts, not emotion. She explained how the event had been scheduled without permission, that she had requested it be canceled, and that she believed decisions like this should never happen without open conversations. She ended it with a simple question. "Has something similar ever happened to you?" She placed the letters in mailboxes of neighbors she hadn't spoken to yet, and went to bed hoping at least one person would respond. The next day, 3 handwritten notes appeared in her own mailbox. Each was short, but meaningful. One neighbor said they'd once received a notice for landscaping changes. They never agreed to and were charged a fee. Another said the HOA had declined their request to use the neighborhood park for a birthday party, but later approved a similar request for another family. A third thanked her for having the courage to speak up. Emma read each note slowly, her heart feeling just a little lighter. Later that evening, she received a quiet knock on her door. It was a man named Paul who lived 2 streets over, someone she'd only seen in passing. He held a coffee in one hand and one of her letters in the other. "I just wanted to say I think you're doing the right thing," he said. "Most of us have been keeping our heads down, but maybe it's time we stop doing that." Emma smiled. "I'm glad you came." They talked for nearly an hour about neighborhood life, how people had felt unheard, and how small decisions over time had left residents feeling powerless. As Paul left, Emma stood at her doorway and looked out at the quiet street. It was still her lawn, still her porch, but it no longer felt like she was standing alone. The whispers were getting louder, and soon someone was going to have to listen. The following morning, Emma awoke to find an envelope taped to her front door. The HOA logo sat squarely at the top, printed in bold blue letters. She opened it quickly, half expecting an apology or at least acknowledgement of her requests. It wasn't either. The letter stated that the wedding would proceed as scheduled. It included a brief paragraph referencing a temporary use clause that Emma had never seen before, and a vague warning about non-cooperation affecting neighborhood harmony. There was no mention of her previous letter, no explanation for the lack of permission, and no offer to meet. Emma folded the paper slowly and sat on her porch, staring at the wedding arch still standing in her yard. Decorations had been refreshed overnight, new ribbons, a table with a lace runner, and now what looked like folding tents waiting to be raised. The silence that followed her earlier outreach was now replaced with a quiet pushback. Some neighbors who had smiled just days ago were now distant. A few avoided eye contact when she walked past. Word had spread, and it seemed the HOA was trying to reframe the story that Emma was being difficult, that she was disrupting a happy occasion. That afternoon, a delivery van pulled up and dropped off catering equipment at the end of her driveway. Emma stepped outside. "Excuse me," she called. The driver looked up. "This is for the wedding. Address says here." "This is my house," she replied. "There's no wedding happening here." The man blinked, then slowly packed the items back into the van. That night, Emma sat with her laptop, drafting a more formal statement. She had tried to be polite. She had tried to speak privately. But now, it was time to be clear. She posted an open letter on the neighborhood's digital bulletin board, the one all residents received by email every Sunday. The message was respectful but firm. She explained everything in detail: how the event had been planned without consent, how she had asked for communication, how she had offered to meet, and how she'd been met with silence and vague warnings. She ended the letter with a sentence that rang in her own ears after she typed. No one should be expected to give up control of their own home, especially without being asked first. By morning, Emma's message had been read hundreds of times. Some neighbors replied publicly, thanking her for sharing. Others stayed silent. But Emma noticed something different when she walked her dog later that day. Heads nodded again. Few waved. Someone even gave her a quiet thumbs up from across the street. But the HOA didn't stay quiet for long. 2 days later, she received a formal notice stating that if she attempted to obstruct or interfere with the planned wedding, the board would review her standing as a member of the neighborhood association. It was vague, almost theatrical, but clear in tone. Emma sat at her kitchen table, reading the letter 3 times. They were trying to intimidate her. She leaned back, took a slow breath, and reached for her phone. It was time to call in help. Not from a lawyer or a neighbor, but someone who could make her position crystal clear. Her next move wasn't emotional. It was logical, firm, and simple. She would remove everything from her yard, and she would do it legally the next morning. She placed a call to a local property services crew, not to destroy anything, but to clear every item, every chair, every arch, every sign off her lawn. If the HOA wanted a ceremony, they could plan it somewhere else, because Emma had finally drawn the line. The crew arrived early on a bright Saturday morning, just 3 days before the scheduled wedding. A small team of professionals in plain gray uniforms stepped out of their truck, took a walk around the property with Emma, and listened carefully as she pointed out what needed to go. No damage, she told them. Just remove everything that was placed here without my say-so. I want my property back to the way it was. The lead crew member nodded. We've got you covered. Within the hour, folding chairs were stacked and loaded into the truck. The floral arch came down carefully, its frame creaking slightly as it was lifted from the ground. The table linens were folded. The extra tents, still half collapsed in Emma's driveway, were taken apart and packed away. Emma stood nearby the entire time, arms crossed, her face calm but focused. A few neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains. 1 or 2 walked by a little slower than usual, taking in the scene. Nobody said anything, not yet, but the quiet was thick with curiosity and tension. By midday, her lawn was empty again. The porch was clean. The breeze swept through without catching on a single ribbon. It was the first time in weeks that her home looked like her own. Emma thanked the crew, paid the invoice, and watched as they drove off. She felt lighter, as if she had cleared more than just furniture. She had cleared space to breathe. Later that afternoon, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. Hello, she answered. A voice on the other end replied briskly. Ms. Turner, this is Margaret Brooks from the HOA board. We understand that you've removed the wedding setup. Is that correct? Yes, Emma said plainly. This was on my private property without my consent. There was a pause. Then came the tone she had expected. That event was part of a larger effort to bring the neighborhood together. The decision was made in good faith. You may not realize how disruptive your actions have been. Emma stayed calm. I made several requests to cancel the event. I was ignored. I posted a public message explaining my position. That too was met with more pressure. I chose the only action left. The wedding is still scheduled for Tuesday, Margaret replied. The board will need to discuss next steps. Emma didn't flinch. That's fine, but it won't be at my house. She ended the call. That night she sat with a cup of tea and watched the sunset from her now cleared porch. It felt like the ranch was breathing with her. Quiet, steady. And hers again. The silence didn't last long, though. The next morning, a new message appeared on the neighborhood bulletin board. It was from the HOA board announcing an urgent update about the scheduled wedding. The location had been moved to the community green space near the clubhouse. Emma stared at the screen for a long moment. Then let out a small, satisfied state. Breath, it wasn't a public apology, and it certainly wasn't a change in policy. But it was a sign that her message had been heard, loud and clear. She wasn't looking for credit. She didn't need a parade. She just wanted her home to remain what it was meant to be. Private, peaceful, and hers to protect. As she walked her dog that evening, several neighbors stopped to chat. Some thanked her quietly. Others asked questions. Curious about how she'd stood her ground so calmly, Emma smiled and kept the conversations light. She had never intended to start a movement, just to draw a line where one needed to be drawn. And in doing so, she had reminded the neighborhood of something simple and powerful. Every front door has meaning, Kate, and every homeowner deserves to. Decide what happens behind it. Emma hadn't expected much beyond a quiet resolution. She was content knowing the wedding would no longer take place at her home, and that her property had finally been respected. But what followed was something she hadn't planned for. Attention by Monday morning. A local neighborhood blog had picked up her open letter. It was reposted under the headline, "Homeowner pushes back after surprise event scheduled on her." Property within hours. It had been shared dozens of times on social media, with comments pouring in from readers around town. Some people were shocked that such a thing could even happen. Others applauded Emma's calm, firm approach. Few questioned the HOA's process. The most surprising part? Many residents from different neighborhoods chimed in, sharing their own stories about unclear policies, miscommunication, and situations that felt out of their control. Emma scrolled through the comments slowly. She hadn't set out to be part of a larger discussion, but clearly her experience had struck a chord. That afternoon, a reporter from a local news station reached out asking for a short interview. Emma hesitated at first, but after speaking with a few supportive neighbors, she agreed under one condition. The conversation would focus on improving clarity between homeowners and HOA boards, not placing blame. When the news segment aired the next evening, it was short and respectful. Emma stood on her freshly cleared porch, explaining what happened in a calm, measured tone. "I think it's important that homeowners feel heard," she said to the camera. "This isn't about conflict, it's about communication. My hope is that something positive can come from this." The coverage only increased interest. Emma received more emails, messages, and even a few handwritten notes dropped at her door. Some thanked her for speaking up. Others shared stories. One note, written on simple lined paper, read, "You said what many of us have been thinking for years. Thank you for reminding us that we have a voice." But not everyone was pleased. Later that week, Emma received another letter from the HOA board. It was more formal this time, carefully worded and professional. They stated that while the wedding had been successfully relocated, the board would be reevaluating member engagement strategies moving forward. It was vague but clearly a response to the public attention. Still, Emma knew things had shifted. That week, several neighbors asked if she would attend the next HOA meeting and speak on behalf of the residents who wanted more transparency and inclusion in decision-making. She agreed, not out of anger, but because she saw an opportunity to help steer the neighborhood in a better direction. When the day of the wedding arrived, Emma stayed inside. She could hear soft music coming from the clubhouse green space, distant laughter, and the sound of celebration. She was glad the couple still had their special day, just not in a place they weren't welcome to begin with. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Paul, the neighbor who'd first come to her with encouragement, stopped by with a box of cookies and a smile. "You've started something," said. "People are talking in a good way." Emma smiled, accepting the box. "All I did was say no when someone tried to make a decision for me. And sometimes," Paul said, "that's all it takes." They sat on the porch for a few minutes, sharing small talk and watching the quiet street below. There were no folding chairs, no banners, no unfamiliar guests, just a peaceful lawn and a home that felt whole again. Emma didn't know what the next HOA meeting would bring, or how deep the changes might go, but she felt something important had been set in motion, not because she made noise, but because she stood still when it counted. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. Emma arrived early. The sun was just beginning to set behind the hills. A few neighbors were already gathered near the entrance, chatting in hushed tones. As she walked inside, Emma noticed something different. The rows of folding chairs, usually only half filled, were almost completely occupied. Residents she'd never seen at meetings before were present, some holding printed copies of her open letter, others quietly waiting. For the first time in a long while, people had shown up and they were paying attention. At the front of the room sat the 5 board members behind a long table. Mr. Stevens, the board president, adjusted his microphone and welcomed everyone. His usual tone was calm and official, but tonight it carried a slight edge of caution. After the standard updates and budget reports, the meeting shifted to resident comments. Emma stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse, she simply spoke. "I'm not here to create conflict," she began. "I'm here because something happened on my property that should not have, and it opened my eyes to how easily decisions can be made without homeowners feeling heard." The room was still. Emma continued, sharing the timeline of what had happened from her return home to the letter on her door, to clearing her lawn when no one would listen. "I know not everyone agrees with how I handled it, but I believe we all want the same thing. Respect. Respect for our homes, our voices, and our right to be part of decisions that affect us." A few neighbors clapped softly. 1 or 2 nodded. She glanced at the board. "What I'm asking isn't complicated. Clear communication, transparent policies. No decisions made about someone's home without their direct permission. That's it." When she sat down, a few more neighbors stood up, one by one. Paul spoke next. "This isn't just about Emma," he said. "It's about how we all feel. We want to support our neighborhood, but it has to feel like a conversation, not a one-sided decision." Another neighbor shared how she once requested a small garden bed but was denied without explanation. A retired man in the back mentioned he'd stopped coming to meetings years ago because nothing ever changed. That night, something was different. The board listened. After nearly an hour of respectful but firm discussion, Mr. Stevens leaned into the mic. "We've heard your concerns," he said. "We acknowledge that communication needs to improve and we're committed to making adjustments." He outlined a new initiative, a policy review committee made up of both board members and residents. The goal would be to revise event procedures, clarify homeowner permissions, and improve how the board engaged with the community. They invited Emma to be part of the group. She agreed. Not because she trusted the process yet, but because she believed it was a start. As the meeting ended and neighbors spilled out into the warm night, Emma felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. People came up to her, shaking her hand, sharing thanks, and offering their own ideas. "This feels different," someone said. "It is," Emma replied. "It's the first time we've all really spoken up." Later, as she walked home under a quiet sky, Emma passed by her front yard, now empty. Peaceful and fully hers again. It hadn't been easy. Standing up never was. But now the neighborhood was listening. And for the first time, real change was on the table. Not because of a fight, but because one person had said, "Enough," and others had finally joined in. The turning point had come not with confrontation, but with clarity, and Emma had no intention of letting that momentum fade. The days following the HOA meeting felt lighter. The energy in the neighborhood had shifted, not with loud celebration, but with quiet understanding. For the first time in years, people were talking not just about regulations or events, but about what it meant to live in a place where voices mattered. Emma joined the first meeting of the new policy review committee the following week. It was held in the same room as the HOA gatherings, but the setup was different. Chairs were arranged in a circle. No podium. No microphones. It's just people, residents, board members, and volunteers all sitting at the same level. Notebooks open. Pens ready. The first topic on the agenda was simple: how to handle future neighborhood events. This time, though, the conversation didn't revolve around permissions buried in paperwork. It focused on respect, consent, and common sense. Emma offered her thoughts when needed, but mostly listened. She was surprised by how open the discussion was. Mr. Stevens, the board president, even admitted that the situation at her house had been a wake-up call. "We were trying to do something positive," he said, "but we didn't think enough about the process or the people involved." Emma appreciated his honesty. That one sentence felt like a crack in a wall that had long needed opening. Over the next few weeks, the group worked on a new homeowner approval form, made it clear that no private property could be used for any event without written consent, and set up a communication system that would notify residents of proposed plans. With time to respond, it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Back on her ranch, Emma took on small projects that had been delayed during the chaos. She trimmed the garden, repainted her front porch, and added a new swing to the tree near the fence, something she'd wanted for years but never made time for. One afternoon, Paul stopped by again, this time with his kids in tow. "We just wanted to see the famous front yard," he joked. Emma laughed. "No weddings scheduled today, promise." They sat on the porch chatting about the upcoming fall fair, which the HOA had recently planned, this time with full approval from every participating resident. The event would be held at the park, and neighbors had been invited to help organize booths and activities. Emma had even signed up to bake pies for the dessert table, something she never thought she'd volunteer for. But things felt different. Now, there was trust, there was conversation, there was, finally, a sense of shared ownership in how the neighborhood worked. A few evenings later, as the sun set behind the hills, Emma sat quietly on her porch swing, listening to the wind move through the tall grass. She thought about how everything had started with a simple moment, a wedding arch she hadn't asked for, standing in the middle of her lawn. It could have stayed just a moment of frustration, but she had spoken up, and when she did, she discovered that others had been waiting for someone to say something first. Not because they couldn't, but because sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind others that they're not alone. That changes weren't just in policy. They were in the way people greeted each other, in the way the board now invited input, before acting, and in how Emma herself felt, not just like a homeowner, but like someone whose presence truly mattered. Her house stood as it always had, quiet, simple, and surrounded by the wide open space she loved. But now, it wasn't just a home she was protecting. It was a reminder that one person, standing up for what's right, can start something far bigger than they ever imagined.